Welcome to another episode of Before You Kill Yourself with your host, Leo Flowers. Today's guest is Dr. Andrew D. Huberman, who is an American neuroscientist and tenured professor in the Department of Neurobiology at the Stanford University School of Medicine. He has made numerous important contributions to the fields of brain development, brain plasticity, and neural regeneration and repair. Huberman was awarded the McKnight Foundation Neuroscience Scholar Award and a Biomedical Scholar Award from the Pew Charitable Trust. He is a recipient of the 2017 Arvo Kogan Award for making major contributions to the fields of vision, science, and efforts to regenerate the visual system and cure blindness. In today's episode, we talk about how to beat jet lag. What are the macronutrients for your mental health? Why suicide is a distortion of space and time. What's the purpose of grief? We also talk about why your neurology is modifiable. Well, the way your brain operates, there's plasticity, baby. We can do some work up in there. And we also talk about how knowing the duration, path, and outcome can reduce your anxiety, and obviously so much more. Now, you'll notice that there are just a couple of strange edits in the episode, and that's because we did talk about some topics that I thought might be triggering to you, the listeners, they were triggering for myself, and so I edited them out, and some of them weren't completely clean edits. So you may notice that, and so just know that I did that because I'm always thinking of you, the listener. And the last thing I want to do is to discuss or share anything on this podcast that would knowingly trigger you, and just represent the opposite of why we're here. And as always, if you're a corporate executive who has just lost their job or going through a career change, or you've been married for 20 years and now you're going through a divorce, go to thrivewithleo.com for one-on-one coaching with yours truly. Remember, I started this podcast because I've struggled with pain and despair, transitions and tragedies. And I want to share with you how I got myself through those moments, how I was able to thrive on the other side. So go to thrivewithleo.com for coaching with yours truly. Let's get to tomorrow together. And with that said, let's jump into the episode.
Yeah, I have a 90-pound English Bulldog Mastiff, and he is the laziest dog on the planet. And it's awesome because he just he just loves life, you know.
It seems opposite of you.
I did it on purpose because I'm pretty type A, and the Bulldog has their most natural rhythm is rest. And I just thought it'd be good for me, especially since I want to bring my dog to lab and stuff. I do like to run and hike and get outdoors, and he can't do any of that with me. But, he reminds me that, it's sort of a yin-yang thing, yin-yang.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about a scientist or a neuroscientist and being in a lab as much as you are, by the way, you have the most diverse cast of lab members I've ever seen. I looked at the website. And I was like, it looks like a United Benetton ad.
Cool. I'll tell them that. You know what? Thank you for mentioning that. You know what's wild is that was true long before any of the kind of that was not a political move. That was just because my lab has always been about 50% men, 50% women. It's always just naturally been diverse by country, by ethnicity, by race, by sexual orientation. It's just always been that way. And it's one of the things I love about my lab. And then, because right now, because of all this recent events, people are a lot of companies are like scrambling to make sure their board looks diverse and things like that. And I just sat back and was like, we can always do better. I said that on the Rogan podcast. We can always do better, but we've always just naturally kind of hit that rhythm. And I think it's because I like being surrounded by people with a lot of different backgrounds. I have friends who are scientists, friends who are creatives, who are fighters, SEAL team guys. Like I genuinely love diversity of ideas and backgrounds. It's like, that's but so thank you. That's actually that's very gratifying for me to hear, because that's us. That's the Huberman Lab, you know?
And I would imagine, as being as creative as you are, also like it generates a wealth of different ideas where you start connecting dots and seeing dots that you otherwise wouldn't have seen or connected.
It's wild, because when you run a laboratory, it's so different than doing science on your own, because you're doing science as a team. And so that diversity of outlook and opinion becomes the strength. I was trained in a very interesting environment. My first advisor, it was just me and him in the lab. There wasn't anybody else. So I got a lot of like one-to-one training. Then my graduate advisor, she was a phenomenal scientist. Unfortunately, she passed away, but she too young. But she was very pure scientist, but really believed that the best way to get training in science was to just go into the lab and do experiments. And we didn't get a lot of attention from her unless we asked for it, and then she'd give us attention. And then my postdoc advisor was a guy named Ben Barris, who actually started his life and scientific career as Barbara Barris. So he was transgendered, female to male transgender. Really interesting story. I mention him in case people want to look him up. He's actually quite well known. What's interesting is Ben was an identical twin. So he had an identical twin sister. His mom was treated with a androgenic drug that masculinized his brain in utero. His sister is perfectly happy being a woman. He always felt uncomfortable as a woman, transitioned to being male. So my postdoc advisor was transgender. That was my first experience with somebody transgender. And he was really a strong advocate for diversity in science. And he went to the mat for diversity in science. And unfortunately, he passed away. I have the young as well from pancreatic cancer. But if you look him up, there's a lot out there about Ben. He was the first transgender member of the National Academy of Sciences. He was extremely irreverent. Like he would say whatever he thought, and he'd say it directly, and he'd say it to people's faces. He went after some very high-profile people in academia. I'll let you look that up on the internet. He's the reason why certain presidents of certain world-famous universities had to step down. He was not a gotcha kind of guy. Like, he wouldn't have – I don't know how he would have felt in today's kind of cancel culture. That wasn't his style. His style was, if you can't back up something with a really good argument and data, well, then he was just going to trample it. But if you could, he would bend his opinion. He would, over time, he would change the way he thought about things. And so Ben had these legendarily long, huge lab meetings. There were 30 of us in his lab when I was a postdoc, and the lab meetings would go like 4 or 5 hours, and we would just fight and fight, never physically, just like brawl over concepts and ideas. And we'd all walk out of there respecting each other. Sometimes it needed some cleanup later, you know, people's feelings would get hurt. We're all human, but it was amazing. And so that was my training. And then now, you know, my lab's a very peaceful place. I like to think we all get along. But I was trained in an environment where if you said something, you had to back it up, and people were going to come at you, and they weren't going to believe you. And so it was a great training. It had a ton of diversity, but also diversity of idea, and everyone learned to speak up. I'll just say this. The one thing that Ben insisted on was that if you went to meetings, you had to ask questions. In fact, if you were at one of his people and you were at a meeting and you weren't getting up to the microphone and asking questions, he would come over and he'd say, I'm going to send you home. You're not here to be a spectator. You got to get up off the bench and you got to interact. And it was great. We all developed really thick skins. We all learned to be wrong in public. We all learned to be right in public. We all learned how to defend our ideas. It was so good. And, you know, if Ben were alive today, he passed away at the end of 2017, but if Ben were alive today, I think he would have liked some of the things that he's seeing, but I think he would have encouraged more, you know, more arguing, but of course, with the goal being arriving at a decision or a common set of ideas and based in fact and those arguments. It was a beautiful training. I feel so blessed that I had that training, and I miss all three of my advisors dearly. But these days, I think a lot about Ben in particular. So if you look him up, Ben Barris, Barres, or you want to read his book, Autobiography of a Transgendered Scientist, I think it's called, or something like that. I wrote his obituary for Nature. You can find it online. Just Google my name and Ben Barris's name, you'll find it. He's a remarkable human being, and I think we need more Ben Barrises out there, regardless of what they're, transgender or not. We just need more people who are willing to encourage young people to argue and disagree, with the goal being to arrive at some consensus based on diversity of ideas and facts. So there you go. Sorry for the little soapbox there, but you can't have a discussion about diversity without with me without me referencing the heavy and important influence of Ben Barris, who was also an amazing scientist and neurologist. And this guy came from very humble beginnings, so was not a guy kind of waltzed into the pedigree of science. He was a fighter, and he worked so hard for himself and for others. Amazing human being.
You talk about panoramic vision in a lot of the interviews that I've watched, and it's made me so aware of how much time I'm spending in front of the screen. What do you think are the implications for students being homeschooled and stress levels because they're spending so much more time in front of a screen?
Yeah. Well, the young brain is adaptive. And so I think, what stresses the adult brain doesn't necessarily stress the young brain. But there are some things that are universal. Doesn't matter what age people are, that are not good for their brains and bodies. So like saying, when you're a kid, you can get away with eating more sugar and bad food than you can when you're an adult before health issues set in. But it's not really good at any age, right? So I'm going to answer your question backwards on purpose. So by just saying what I believe based on a lot of science, some from my lab, but also from other labs, are very beneficial practices. I just want to put these out there. I'll return to these. But getting some sunlight in your eyes first thing in the morning when you wake up, within the first hour of waking. Ideally, sunlight before screen light, but a lot of people, including myself, reach immediately for the phone or tablet or computer. Even if it's cloudy out, getting some sunlight in your eyes. Huge, huge positive effects of doing that. Increases mitochondrial function in the eye. We know that. Improves timing of hormone release. Cortisol in the morning is good. Melatonin in the evening to help you get sleepy and sleep better. Dopamine release, this feel-good molecule that's released in the brain, all regulated by that morning sunlight. If you get too far into the day and you don't get that sunlight, you can't go get it by stepping outside in the afternoon. It's not the same. You have a so-called circadian rhythm, which just means about 24-hour rhythm in all your cells. So blood sugar regulation, it even sets you up for proper blood, better blood sugar regulation. So, if there was one thing that was going to really help people, it would be that. The next one would also be, and it has to be sunlight to the eyes. It's not sunlight to the skin with dark sunglasses on or with a hat on. It's sunlight to the eyes, 2 to 10 minutes. If it's a cloudy day, maybe 10 to 20 minutes. You don't have to be staring directly in the sun. Please don't do that because you could damage your eyes. But, getting bright light in your eyes, ideally from sunlight, not artificial light. Even on a cloudy day, it comes through. The other one is panoramic vision. So rather than staring into a little small box, getting into a mode where you're looking at a horizon or looking off in the distance at something really far away, as far as you possibly can. Try and see that at least 3 times a day, even if it's just for moments, especially if you're in an apartment living or you're in a big city. Maybe you stare out at an alley. Get outside and find that horizon, or get up on the roof if you can do it safely. Find that horizon. Just do it. There's a natural reset for your nervous system. And then even better would be optic flow, self-generated optic flow. So this is when you're walking, biking, running, driving won't do it. Could even be in a wheelchair. If you're in a wheelchair, as long as you're pushing along and you're doing movement with your body and there's visual images flowing by on your retina, on your eyes, it quiets this threat detection center in the brain called the amygdala and de-stresses you. Exercise is not just about the bodily effects. It's also de-stressing you at the level of your neurology through your visual system. Now, you imagine these 3 things: sunlight, optic flow, and horizon viewing. You could combine all those. Get out in the morning, take a walk outside without sunglasses on, provided you can do that safely, and you're good, right? I mean, basically, that's what you want to do. And ideally, you might do it for 5-10 minutes in the evening also, before the sun goes down or shortly after the sun goes down. So basic. And if people aren't doing that and it's all video games and optic flow through video games and the Peloton or walking around your apartment, you're going to feel more claustrophobic and stressed. Your brain is not de-stressing. All animals know to do this intuitively, but humans, we've got so many creature comforts inside the confines of our walls, and now we're also being encouraged to stay indoors for physical distancing reasons that we are abusing our neurology, and we are going to pay the price if we don't reverse on this. Fortunately, everything I described is cost-free. If there are blind people out, my lab works on blindness as well, so I just want to be respectful of the people that might have low vision or no vision. You can still many cases, getting that morning light can still set their circadian rhythm as long as you still have some cells in your eyes. If, God forbid you have no eyes, you can set your circadian rhythms through elevated activity early in the day or auditory activity. You can contact me if you're blind and you have questions about that. So children and adults need to do this every day. If you miss a couple days because you're traveling, if you're on a plane to Hong Kong or something and you can't do this because you happen to be in the plane, you'll be fine if you miss a day or two. But not getting enough sunlight early in the day or light in your eyes early in the day is half the problem. The other half of the problem is people are getting too much light in their eyes from artificial sources in the middle of the night between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m. And that suppresses these dopamine pathways, these feel-good molecule pathways. And these are published results, can, lead to depression, deficits in learning. It's the last thing I'll say about this, whether or not you're struggling with mental health issues or not, whether or not you consider yourself a high performer or just somebody who's just trying to keep up in life, I have to say that every group I know of people that have very demanding jobs. So I do some work with special operations, military, both domestic and abroad. And what you find is, those are high risk, high consequence, very intense careers. Lives are on the line, often on a daily basis. And it's these little things that lead to stability of a nervous system, stability of a psychological system. Of course, life events can impact us, traumas, losses, those are important too. But these practices that I'm talking about, which are cost-free and available to everybody, are the foundation of your neurology. They set that what I call the bedrock or the foundation of your stability. And it's these little things, none of them on their own feel amazing. It's not like going to a concert or something like that, but light in the morning, avoiding light in the middle of the night, getting into self-generated optic flow, social connection. We can talk about how that helps as well. And having a gratitude practice where you just concentrate on the few things maybe, or the many things that you do have, whatever it is, something that's not the same as complacency, but that can make a true difference in your neurology, which then can allow you to lean into more, kind of ambitious pursuits. So we can't afford to not do these, what seem like small things. The small things really are the big things. And stealing from a friend of mine, Pat Dossett, who's a 9-year veteran of the SEAL teams, really good friend of mine, impressive human being at many levels. He always says that, people think they're these high performance tools. It's really crawl, walk, run. It's the little things, those small investments that you make on a daily basis that support your neurology and allow you to deal with stress better, to deal with conflict better, to reach further. This is not an inspirational speech. This is really just about our kind of core biology. These are the macronutrients of mental health. It's like water, sunlight, gratitude, social connection. These are the nutrients that you need for your nervous system.
I love that. And there's so many things in there that I want to unpack, because you talked about optic flow. And I remember when one of my old therapists suggested that I do EMDR to help me deal with some past traumas. And I didn't really understand it, and I still don't quite understand it now. Can you explain, because I know that ties somewhat into optic flow. Can you explain how that works and if it's effective?
Yeah, so EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. It is the discovery of Francine Shapiro, who was a therapist who discovered on her own that when she took walks and thought about some things that were troubling to her, that she was better able to process that information, a little less emotional load, a little more clarity. And over time, she developed a technique that involved having patients, because she was a clinician, sit in her office and move their eyes from side to side with their eyes open. So it's head stationary, looking from side to side, sweeping the eyes from side to side. It looks ridiculous from the outside, not eyes up and down, eyes side to side. And she did that while people recounted their traumas and found, and there's a lot of good science on this now, that statistically they found relief from their traumas over time. Now, a few things. Why the eye movement side to side? Well, it turns out when you walk or move in any way with your eyes open, you are making those same eye movements from side to side reflexively. It's part of the balance system that adjusts for so-called image slip on the retina. I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of the science of the visual vestibular system, but you need to, every time you move your head or eyes or body, the visual image on your retina, on the back of your eye, it moves. But unlike an iPhone or a smartphone where you take a picture and you move your phone, it gets blurry, you see the world as stable because you make these what are called image slip compensating eye movements. So she was smart enough to realize the walk would have been great, but she couldn't always take her patients walking. First of all, she wanted to be facing them. Second of all, not all of them were mobile. Third, sometimes it's raining out. There were good reasons to try and bring it to the clinic. And fortunately for us, she didn't have people treadmill, because if they were on a treadmill, they wouldn't experience optic flow and their eyes wouldn't move. She brought the eye movement component to the clinic. Now, here's what I understand about EMDR at a clinical level. I want to emphasize I'm not an MD, I'm a scientist. But I have a close colleague in the Department of Psychiatry at Stanford. He's actually the associate chair. I talked to him about this, and he said EMDR is very effective for treatment of what are sort of called discrete traumas, where it could be something that happened often, but it's easy to describe. It's one thing. Like, you wouldn't want to use EMDR to try and release the trauma of, say, your entire childhood or an entire military deployment or an entire episode of life. But if it's around one specific thing, a particular traumatic event or a traumatic event that happened again and again and was fairly discrete, then EMDR done with a clinician, of course, this is a American Medical Association certified practice. If you do that with a clinician who does EMDR, certified for EMDR, then statistically it can bring substantial relief, which is great. So what it's doing is it's actually quieting the amygdala. So actually, people used to talk to me about EMDR, and I'll be honest, as a vision scientist, because my lab works on vision and a guy who works on stress, I thought it was crazy. I was like, how in the world do these lateral eye movements help with the brain? It just doesn't make any sense. And I kind of chalked it up to just kind of woo stuff. And I was dismissive of it. And I regret that I was, because over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been no fewer than 5 peer-reviewed, really high-quality papers published in high-quality journals from excellent laboratories looking at these eye movements in EMDR and showing that it very dramatically and quickly reduces the activity of this brain area, the amygdala, the threat detection center in the brain. So I ate my words there, and it has a real neurologic basis, probably in deep-rooted evolutionary biology, whereby animals or people that are moving forward are naturally going to suppress their stress level so that they can continue forward movement. I mean, forward movement, not just walking, but moving into uncharted territories is kind of at the foundation of our progress as a species. If we backed away every time we felt some stress or anxiety, we would not have all the amazing technologies and things that we've built as humans. And I realize in 2020, we are feeling very compromised in terms of our progress and state of affairs. But believe me, 100 years ago, more people died in childbirth. Mothers died in childbirth. There was far more disease and famine and lack of sanitation. I mean, we got a long way to go, but things are much better now. But these, we still have to deal with stress. So nowadays we have one kind of stress. Back then we had another kind of stress. And 300 years ago, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, you can bet that a couple guys or some ladies and guys sat down and had a conversation about how to deal with stress. This is not a new conversation. But EMDR turns out to be a powerful way of leveraging the visual system and these eye movements to recreate the neurologic sense that the body is moving forward, and in doing so, quieting these brain areas that evoke a sense of threat or fear. And if someone recounts a trauma while doing that, then they're able to be in connection with those events and reprogram the relationship. So if they can talk about it without feeling as stressed over time, the idea is that then they will feel no stress when they think about that event. Because let's face it, it's very hard to forget events entirely. What the whole basis of EMDR and trauma release therapy and behavioral desensitization and the sorts of things we do in my lab with fear are all based on trying to invoke neuroplasticity, trying to rewire the emotional load that a given experience has.
I appreciate you sharing that with me. And the question that comes to mind, because we talked about, the optic flow, sunshine, and, being outside, that vitamin D, being part of the macronutrients of mental health. I would assume then that you probably have studied astronauts, and what have you learned from them that could, for people who may not have access to sunlight? I'm thinking about people who live like in Antarctica for a year, and then they're months without sunlight. How does that play into it?
Well, my lab hasn't looked at that directly. The closest I've come to actual astronauts, I did do a podcast very different from this one. Normally, I wouldn't mention a podcast on a podcast, but very different from this one was with the so-called MCTI, the Mission Critical Team Institute, run by my friend Coleman Ruiz and others. And it's an interesting podcast because it goes out to first responders, military, ex-military, and the astronauts. It's actually played up to the space station. So there's some guys and ladies up in the space station that listen to the MCTI podcast. It's more about teams and work in teams, but also some other topics as well. And so I look forward to communicating with astronauts directly. But here's what we know: every cell in your body has this 24-hour circadian clock. Every cell needs to know what time of day and what time of year it is, believe it or not, because day length changes across the year, less so in California, but certainly in areas of Scandinavia. And as you get further from the equator, winter days are very short, summer days are very long. And every cell in your body and every organ in your body and your whole body as a system is incorporating that information into rhythms of digestion, rhythms of mood, rhythms of wanting to mate or not mate, rhythms of happiness or kind of more solemn moods. And when people go up in the space shuttle, or if they spend time in it at living nocturnally, maybe they're a first responder, or maybe they're having insomnia, they're sleeping a lot during the day, they're not getting a lot of light, they're up all night watching screens. We know that pretty much every process in the body gets worse. Outcomes for cancer, likelihood of getting Alzheimer's, all that stuff. Now, I don't want to scare people, but we know that astronauts suffer tremendously from things like glaucoma, challenges reorienting their body clocks, because it's a pretty unusual thing to get out that far from the normal rhythms of the sun and the earth. And, every day, 24 hours, the fact that we have a 24-hour clock in every cell of our body is not a coincidence. The earth spins once every 24 hours, and we need to anchor to something. So it's kind of cool if you step back from a positive side of it and think every cell in your body is matched to the movement of the planets. Now, this isn't astrology. This is literally the genes of your cells, the cellular processes, the function of your liver, your gut, your heart, your brain are all linked to that 24-hour spin, because there was strong evolutionary pressure for us to be active during the day and asleep at night. Now we have artificial lights. We can get away from that. But the further you get away from that cycle, the worse things get. There's a beautiful study done out of the University of Colorado showing that students get really messed up rhythms during the semester just by way of staying up late and sleeping in and not getting light in their eyes at the appropriate times of day. And their cortisol rhythms, which is the stress hormone that you want high in the morning and low the rest of the time, starts getting all out of whack. Melatonin, which you want high at night, helps you fall asleep. I'm not talking about supplementing. I'm talking about the melatonin you make in your own brain. High at night, low in the day, gets all out of whack. And what they found in the study was if these students got sunrise exposure and sunset exposure just for 2 days, it completely and you have to see it with your eyes, completely reset their cortisol and melatonin rhythms for days afterwards. This is published in Current Biology, Cell Press Journal, beautiful paper. And they've had a number of papers like it. So astronauts get really messed up. People that work the graveyard shift or worse, swing shifts are really the worst. When people are working daytime, then they're working nighttime, then they're working daytime, the so-called swing shift. I plan to do a specific post all about swing shift and shift work at some point, because it's kind of detailed how you might want to offset it, because some people just have to do that to make a living. And thank goodness we have people that are in the emergency room in the middle of the night. Thank goodness we have people that are willing to work the graveyard shift, so-called vampire shift, because things happen in the middle of the night. Garbage needs to be taken out. All deliveries need to be made. So I realize not everyone can anchor to a banker's schedule, as they say. But there are things that you can do, and still getting that sunlight in the morning is great. Don't sleep through that if you can avoid sleeping through it. And you don't have to see sunrise. You don't have to see the sun actually cross the horizon. You just need to see it when it's not quite overhead yet, so-called low solar angle. So anyway, I'll riff long on anything you throw to me. So I'll just stop there, and hopefully that was comprehensive enough.
You talked about melatonin and getting sleep. I know a lot of people take a melatonin supplement, and in some cases are giving it to their kids, or maybe just NyQuil to their kids. Is there a negative effect of doing that to sleep for adults and for kids, or is it just about taking it occasionally?
I mean, I don't want to be alarmist, but I think supplementing melatonin is a slippery slope for the following reason. Again, I'm not an MD, so you consult with your doctor. But first of all, melatonin's primary role is to suppress puberty during development. It actually can suppress the activation of estrogen and testosterone in women and men. Obviously, different levels of testosterone and estrogen in different people, but whatever the levels are, they're suppressed by melatonin. The levels of melatonin that one takes to help sleep are 1,000-fold more than you have in your body. So you're really working super physiological, as we say. It's amazing. You need a prescription for estrogen if you're a woman who wants to take estrogen, or anyone that wants to take estrogen. You need a prescription for testosterone, but you can just go to the health food store and buy the hormone melatonin. I think it's a glitch in the system. I mean, this isn't about access to supplements. What it's really about is you're taking a powerful hormone at levels that are just not appropriate for the body. So there are other ways to get better sleep, in my opinion. First of all, melatonin makes you fall asleep. It doesn't keep you asleep. So a lot of people still have a problem waking up in the middle of the night. Again, I'm not a doctor, but I do make, from time to time, I'll talk about what I do for sleep, because sleep was a challenge for me. And there are ways to sleep. First of all, to be better at sleeping. First of all, get that morning sunlight, because it starts a 16-hour clock. 16 hours after that, you're going to get melatonin in your system. So if you're waking up late, or you're waking up early and you're not getting enough sunlight in your eyes, or you think you can get it from artificial light early in the day, you're mistaken. And then you're having trouble falling asleep at night, or you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and it's because you're not timing your circadian rhythms right. So it starts in the morning. Second of all, you need to learn to relax and turn off your thoughts. And that's really tough. I always say it's hard to control the mind with the mind. I think everybody should have a practice that they can look to on a regular basis to teach themselves how to downshift their nervous system. You got this so-called autonomic nervous system. Has a stress element. It has a rest and relaxation element. It's kind of like a seesaw, goes back and forth. And in order to sleep, you have to turn off your thoughts. You need to relax, but you can't just say, I need to relax. So there's a practice that's available free. There are a lot of scripts up for it online called Yoga Nidra. It involves no movement. So this is yoga, Nidra, sometimes spelled Nidre, depending on who's spelling it. You can go on YouTube. There are a number of these scripts. Some are 10 minutes long. Some are 30 minutes long. You do it while waking. You can do it any time of day or night. You lie down and you close your eyes, and it walks you through some breathing and some kind of like a body scan. And all it's designed to do is get you better at relaxing. self-inducing relaxation, which a lot of people struggle with without melatonin, alcohol, or sedatives. So I think it's something that I wish I had known as a kid, but I actually use Yoga Nidra about 3 times a week. I just do a session, 10 to 30 minutes. Any of the ones out there by Kamini Desai, Desai, first name Kamini. It's got Kamini. I actually don't know her. I've never met her. I want to be clear. I have no business relationship to it. I don't make any money or anything off this. It's just the one that we use in lab is kind of we've looked at the effects of these types of practices, and they put the brain into states that are similar to sleep, not quite deep sleep, but they teach you how to get better at falling and staying asleep, which is a great practice. It doesn't involve any drugs, zero cost. There's some apps out there too, and you can explore it. There's some also very long yoga nidras, like 1 hour and stuff. That I think that might be excessive for most people. I do the 10 or 30 minute one. The other thing that can be useful for some people, and again, I'm not recommending people take supplements unless they really want to, and always check with your doctor. But for me, taking magnesium threonate, which is spelled Threonate, magnesium threonate, as well as theanine, Theanine. Those tend to increase GABA, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter that kind of shuts off the front of your brain, so it makes it easier to fall asleep. They have high margins for safety, so that's good. And they just make it easier to fall asleep and stay asleep, and they don't involve taking any hormones. But I always say for anything that you're trying to adjust in your nervous system, look to behaviors first, then nutrition, like you don't want to ingest coffee late in the day. Make sure your nutrition is right. Then supplementation. Then if all of that fails for you, then you might want to look at prescription drugs. And I don't recommend people waste money or time on fancy brain-machine interfaces. I mean, you want to keep the lights in your house dim in the evening, but that's not a brain-machine interface. I am just totally disappointed in how many companies are out there claiming that their device has some real basis in neuroscience because there's a published paper about it. Look, folks, without getting into it in a lot of detail and without sounding too cynical, there are a lot of journals out there. There are pay-to-play journals. There are peer-reviewed journals. There are stringent journals. There are not stringent journals. I am not going to say that any of these devices, I'm not going to name devices, work or don't work. But, trust me, if there was a device you could just snap on, it would make you a better sleeper or something that you would know. It would be widespread in use. And so I think that the thing is to start learning how to downshift through things like Yoga Nidra. Learn to turn the lights down in your house in the evening. Try and stay off your phone from 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. if you can, if safety allows it and your profession allows it. Eat a good meal, but don't, maybe not too close to bedtime, but don't be starving unless you're in some fasting regime or something. Magnesium threonate and theanine can help for sure. I've recommended it to a number of people. They all are excited about it and because it works for them. But there are just a lot of healthier, kind of easier ways to approach the sleep thing before you go all the way to sleeping pills and fancy wake up lights and go to sleep lights and stuff. You can do all that if you want, but if you don't have your behaviors in check, then there's nothing that's really going to save you. You got to have your behaviors in check. That said, the supplements I mentioned, and again, I don't have a supplement company or anything. They can be beneficial, and at least theanine is pretty low cost. Magnesium comes in a lot of different forms, but some of the forms have a real strong laxative effect, and which isn't always good for people. But magnesium threonate doesn't tend to do that. It's more kind of a mild sedative.
You mentioned, first change your behavior and then look at your nutrition. Is there a specific diet that would help one optimize their sleep? And I ask this because I just had my eyes checked yesterday, and the eye doctor said that the Mediterranean diet is the best diet for a person's eyes. Can you speak to that?
I haven't heard that. I'm not laughing at their advice. All right. So I want to be really clear. I'm not a nutritionist. I do love to eat. I think I know a thing or two about nutrition, but there are enough unqualified people out there talking about nutrition on podcasts and the internet that I don't want to add yet another voice to that. But I know what works for me. And I know that it's grounded in a logic that's based in neuroscience, which is typically when we fast or when we eat fewer carbohydrates, we have more adrenaline in our system, more epinephrine in our system, and we tend to be more alert. Actually, if you were to not eat for 2-3 days, before you'd get really lethargic and tired, you would just be really agitated and really hungry. You'd have a ton of energy to go find food. And that's because Mother Nature wired you that way so that you would go find what you need, right? That's what the need-based agitation is based on. Think about any strong biological drive for cold when it's hot, for heat when it's cold, for reproduction when you haven't reproduced, or sex. Those things go hand in hand in biological language anyway. For food when you're hungry, for water when you're thirsty. They all create a sense of agitation. They all present as a mode of pursuit. Okay, so for me, waking up in the morning, I like to hydrate first thing in the morning and just drink water, and then eventually I'd start drinking some caffeine. I love coffee and tea. Do that early in the day, and I tend to eat my first meal I tend to push it out toward noon, and that because it keeps me alert. When I eat, I tend to kind of relax a lot. Now, some people, if you're so focused on food you can't concentrate, that's not good. Then for me, as the evening approaches, that's when I start eating more, and I eat more. I do eat carbohydrates. I know there are people out there who do like all meat diets and stuff, and I'm sure it works for some people, not for others. I like starches. So I think they work for me. So I do eat meat. I do eat some starches. I do eat vegetables. I do believe that there are strong data, double-blind peer-reviewed studies looking at the omega-3 and 6 fatty acids, like eating things like salmon, getting fish oil, fermented foods for probiotics. There's good science to support those as beneficial. But as the evening goes on, I tend to eat more carbohydrates because they lend themselves to serotonin production, which makes it easier to fall asleep and stay asleep. So, everyone, I think some of the lore from the 90s, like, oh, don't eat carbohydrates past 6 p.m. and all this stuff, I think that's crazy. I think I've never seen any good science that shows that that's the case. Where I have seen good science is the work of a former colleague of mine down at the Salk Institute, Sachin Panda, has published beautiful work showing that restricted feeding windows are very powerful for cellular health and organ health. So that means having a 10 to 16-hour window each day where you don't eat anything. Some of that, of course, is in sleep, and then eating in a 4 to 8, maybe a 10-hour window, so-called intermittent fasting. It's very clear that having a period every 24 hours where you're not ingesting any calories can be very helpful for your cellular metabolism, for weight reasons, for cognitive reasons, all sorts of things. But you want to place that feeding window within your day in a way that still allows you to socially connect. I mean, you don't want to be the person canceling dinner with, people you want to see simply because of your eating window. I mean, that seems a little extreme, and not, and counterproductive in life. And the other is to your work and school requirements. So if you find that you're more alert when you have some food in your system, then move that feeding window to that time. If you are like me and you find you're more alert when you don't have food in your system and you're hydrating and maybe a little hungry even, then, for me, that's daytime. So work it different ways. One thing, people aren't traveling a lot right now, but I'll just throw this out there. One of the quickest ways to reset your circadian clock when you travel to a new time zone is because light takes a few days to catch you up to the local time zone. In addition to viewing the sunlight in the local time zone that you arrive in, you also want to try and get on the local meal schedule. So even if you, fly east, or if you're in California, or you fly west, if you're from New York, or you go to, Europe or to Japan or something, you want to hop on the local schedule for eating as much as you can, because it'll help if your goal is to shift your circadian clock quickly, because these rhythms in the body are governed by light foremost, then by food, and then by activity. So light, food, and exercise are how you can shift your clock around. If you wanted to dive deep on that topic ever, I'm happy we could do a whole podcast about circadian rhythms and mental health and physical health. But I think that's I sort of gave a kind of a fire hose approach to it right there. But hopefully there are enough shards of information people can make use of.
Now, I've actually made use of that, and I'm right now I'm learning how to play the guitar. and I used to practice in the afternoon. And what I found is that I will practice now in the morning before I have breakfast, because it goes back to that hunger. Like, I'm so hungry in the morning that, but I tell myself I can't eat until I practice guitar, and I find I have much more intense practice sessions in the morning before breakfast, and then after, when I eat, and it becomes kind of I find that I also eat less after I've practiced guitar for whatever reason. I don't know if it's the dopamine being released, but I don't know. I've interpreted your idea of like hunger and fasting, and then apply that to learning. And I don't know if you've studied that or if that resonates on some level.
Oh, absolutely. That absolutely resonates. And it's because a lot of learning is gated by the neuromodulators, noradrenaline, adrenaline, epinephrine, and acetylcholine. And those are going to be secreted in higher amounts when you are fasting, or when you're in, it's interesting that some of the language we use of hunger, being hungry and in pursuit, as opposed to being, sated and relaxed, that hunger and pursuit is, epinephrine is secreted in our brain when we experience something traumatic. It's secreted, although at lower levels, when we experience something, hunger. The language of the nervous system in biology is pretty generic. And the same mechanisms are employed in a huge variety of circumstances. So that's what we're talking about here. And I would encourage people to also be scientists with it. Unless you have a blood sugar condition that would make experimentation dangerous, play with intermittent fasting and see what eating window works for you. I mean, in theory, everyone's intermittent fasting because you got to be asleep at some point. I don't do long fasts. I've never done a long fast. I just like to eat too much. And I guess I could be inspired to try one, but right now I think it's an interesting time. There's a lot of information out there. There's no one size fits all. Some people do better with more carbohydrates, less, meat and protein. Some people the opposite. And of course, there are ethical and religious reasons and health reasons, and all sorts of stuff plays into this. But it's a great time to get experimental and try something and stick to it, see how it works for you. I know it works for me, and I arrived at it after many decades. And as I get older, I'm 45 next month. As I get older, I'll probably update this stuff. I certainly change it as my exercise schedule and sleep schedule changes. But yeah, that's just the way it is. There's no one size fits all, but they're all grounded in biology.
Well, what's fascinating about the intermittent fasting too is the idea that it does give us a bit more energy, because people struggling with depression, they go either way, where they're either eating too much or too little, and a lot of people will eat with the idea that food gives them energy.
Yeah, I mean, food energy is designed to be ingested and then stored and then used, right? And so neural energy is the energy I'm referring to, but it's, I also know if I'm too hungry, I can't think. So I actually think best when I'm walking or when I'm eating. So that means I'm either walking or eating a lot, sometimes both. So I do encourage people to be experimental with and find what works for them.
Yeah, Steve Jobs was always going on a walk, and he said that helped him connect the dots of whatever he was trying to work on. And I forget the other author. Black Swan. What's it? Nate Talib Nassim.
Nassim
talks about. Yeah. So he talks.
Yeah, I can attest to the Steve Jobs thing, because when I was a postdoc, I lived downtown Palo Alto, right near Stanford, and I'd see Steve Jobs and one of his employees walking every evening. He wore no shoes, as the rumor stated. That was true. And he would walk right past my apartment, and it was amazing. That guy brought no security with him anywhere, despite his stature and his wealth. He was always just walking. I also noticed he was not carrying an iPhone, or if he was, it wasn't out. He really believed in that self-generated optic flow for getting the mind into a particular state.
I'm glad you brought up the iPhone, because I go hiking a lot, and, I will put on a podcast or an audiobook. And I found that after listening to a few of the podcast episodes that you've done and following you on Instagram, that when I'm listening to a book or a podcast that my anxiety levels are a bit higher. And I don't know if it's because I'm hiking or because I'm trying to concentrate on what I'm listening to and hike. And I've heard you mention before that, it's better to go walking without your cell phone. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, it's additional cognitive load to be listening to a story. Now, some people like to do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. I love audiobooks, music, and things like that. I think there's real value in learning to just be with your mind. I also believe that the subconscious mind processes a lot during sleep, especially for creative people. Your mind is reordering and reshuffling the deck all the time. And if you are constantly taking in new sensory information, you never get a chance to access that inner work that your brain is just doing. And so actually I was talking about this on the phone the other night to I'm afraid I don't want to drop his name because A, it'll sound like name dropping, and B, I didn't get his permission. So I don't ever use anyone's name without their permission. But he's a very well-known musician. And we were talking about this and about getting the download in the morning, as we were talking about hearing that inner voice, the, spontaneous insight, creative ideas. For him, it's writing songs. For me, it might be something about science or an idea that I want to test in science. Everybody has different things that they're processing. Maybe they're processing their past or their future. That's what the brain was designed to do in sleep. And then you're supposed to unpack that during the day. And if you're constantly plugged in to a device that's giving you sensory information, and worse, you're looking at it, it's a double whammy. You're not taking in the optic flow of the moment. You're not getting the stress release. And you're also inhibiting, you're blocking the whole design of the brain was to take in information, process it, and then, make adjustments. So now look, I also agree and I acknowledge that there's a certain anxiety in not looking at your phone because we feel like we're out of contact with things. I struggle with this a lot. When I write or when I need to do work, I actually lock my phone in a safe. It used to be worse. I actually used to put my phone up. I used to throw my phone up on the roof when I was writing grants because I found myself, I would always look at the phone. I was like, darn it, I keep looking at this thing reflexively. Then I'd put it away. Then I'd feel like I need to look at it. So I'd throw it up on the roof. But then a couple of them cooked up on the roof in the heat. But I'll be honest, there were times in my life, I might lose a few friends for saying this, but there are times in my life when I actually have taken my phone and I've just, let me put it this way. If anyone wants a couple old iPhones, there are a few sitting in the Pacific Ocean. You can go find them. I've thrown my phone into the ocean maybe 4 or 5 times and just taken a month off from it. And I probably got more done in that month than I did in the previous year before it. But, you need a phone in order to communicate with people. But everyone that I know that's productive, creative, mental, grounded in terms of their mental health has some system, however minor or severe. Mine of throwing my phone in the ocean was a little severe, I admit, of regulating their own impulse to be connected all the time and constantly in the flow of, or non-flow, as the case may be, of sensory information.
Oh my God, I've wanted to throw my cell phone in the ocean so many times, and the fact that you've done it 4 or 5 times, you're my hero, right?
Well, I do have to end up going. I had to go buy a phone, and that stung because they're not cheap. But I'll tell you, it's amazing. Oh, I know one trick I did, which is a little less severe, is when I was working on a manuscript. In the early days of my lab, I went out to my lab and I handed my phone to somebody. I turned it off. I handed it to somebody. My lab was big back then. Now we're a little bit smaller, but I had about 13 people in my lab. And I said, if I ask for this phone back before I submit this grant, you each get $1,000 cash from me. And I shook hands on it. Now that's $13,000 is a pretty steep penalty for, wanting to look at the phone. What I found was the impulse to get that phone back showed up a lot at the beginning, and then by the end, I didn't want it back. So it's kind of interesting how these things work. I think you can expect a period of anxiety, and then for that period to pass. But I succeeded in submitting the paper. They did not get the $13,000 out of me.
I love it. I want to switch gears a little bit and talk a bit about anxiety, because people are always like, "Oh, in these uncertain times," I'm like, they've always been uncertain, but You have a philosophy about anxiety and how to reduce that. Talking about duration, path, outcome. Can you talk to us about that?
Sure. So the brain wants to move things off to reflexive, non-thinking behavior as much as possible. So, your heart rate, your breathing, all handled by brain, and connections with the brain and body, but reflexively. When we have to think about something, we have to analyze duration, how long is it going to last, path, what path to take, outcome, what's going to happen if I follow this duration and path. It's a lot of work, a lot of metabolic load. Anxiety and stress tends to increase our tendency to rely on duration, path, and outcome. Some people think it makes us reflexive, but it just generally can, too much stress isn't good. But, stress was designed to move us, to agitate us, to move us forward towards goals, as we talked about with hunger and thirst and things like that. I think everyone should have tools in their kit, real-time tools and what I call offline tools. Real-time tools for being able to push back on stress might be double inhale through the nose, followed by a big exhale. Repeated 2 or 3 times. What that does is it resets the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your lungs and bloodstream appropriately. There are a lot of different breathing tools out there, but the advice of just take a deep breath or just exhale is not the best advice. It is not grounded in the reality of the neural circuits that control breathing. Double inhales followed by a long exhale capture the activity of a particular set of neurons called the psi neurons that readjust the levels of carbon dioxide and oxygen in your body and brain, and are really great for really quickly bringing your level of stress down. You can do that anytime you want. If you can't breathe through your nose because you have a deviated septum, you should probably breathe through your nose more, and they'll start to dilate. But you can also do what I just described through the mouth if your nose is totally occluded and blocked. The other thing is an offline tool. We all should get better at dealing with stress. You'd say, well, I already have enough stress. But the one way to do that is the whole, cold shower, ice bath thing. But if you don't like that, and frankly, I'm not so crazy about cold showers. I like hot showers. You can do some higher intensity breathing. You can take a couple minutes each day. And for instance, you could breathe in through the nose really deep and then out through the mouth. And you repeat that maybe 20 times. You'll feel pretty agitated. Trust me, it'll feel like stress. And then you can exhale all your air and hold. And what you're doing is you're teaching yourself to be calm with some additional adrenaline in your system. These are the sorts of breathing protocols that my lab is studying. I want to be clear that not all the science is, in yet, but having a tool that you can use in real time, like the double inhale exhale, the physiological sigh that I described, or having a tool that you can look to when you're sort of like, hey, you know what, life is stressful. I want to get more resilient. I want to become a little bit grittier. I want to be able to not feel so stressed, being comfortable, being uncomfortable, as they say. Then you could do something like the kind of breathing I described. I don't recommend doing any long breath holds in any case. Can cause problems for most people. I mean, if you're going to get into long breath holds and that whole thing, you really want to work with somebody like a free diving coach or somebody who really knows what they're doing. I feel like there are a few too many people out there doing crazy breath hold stuff. And it's hard on the cardiopulmonary system. What I just described is really simple. Again, cost-free. It can raise your threshold for stress. Anxious people who get panic attacks are not going to feel comfortable doing that high intensity breathing. So they might want to lean a little bit more toward the kind of calming breathing. You just have to pick what works for you. But those tools work because they were hardwired into our brain and nervous system.
Yeah, I heard you once say that neurotics love New York because the outside matches their inside. And I was like, is that why I love New York? I'm from Chicago originally. Yeah. And I definitely feel like I feel super comfortable. Can you speak to that? And also for people who can't get to New York or can't put themselves in, is there a way to mimic that or recreate that in some other form?
Yeah. So it turns out like we all have an internal kind of metronome. For some people or animals like my bulldog Costello, that metronome is moving very slowly. It's like tick, tick, tick. So when the world around them is moving, it seems to them and to us like if that's your internal rhythm, or you're sleepy, that's your internal rhythm. The outside world is going to seem like it's going really fast. It's going to be like, whoa, I'm not ready for all that yet. Whereas if your internal rhythm is tick, 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 well, then things outside you that are moving at that same frequency, tick, 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 are going to seem in sync with you. And you'll feel like, oh, I'm part of the walking pace of Manhattan. Whereas if you are, for instance, really stressed, let's say you're in line at the grocery store and you got to get your groceries, get home, get your kid, you have a bunch of things on your plate and the person in front of you is returning some items and they're moving slowly. Maybe there's somebody who needs a little more time. It's going to seem like a very long time because your internal metronome is going tick, 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 tick. And when I say internal metronome, I'm not making that up. What it is it's a set of neural circuits that are oscillating at a certain frequency, including your phrenic nerve, your vagus, et cetera. It's not one brain area. It's kind of a collection of them. But if you're like tick, 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 tick internally, well, then things outside you are going to seem like they're going really slow. So I joked on that Rogan podcast. I said, the reason I like New York is because it's fast paced, and I think I'm kind of neurotic meaning I think my internal pace is pretty quick most of the time, not always. And so in New York, I feel right at home. I feel at peace because there's the internal and the external I feel like are matched. They've done some interesting studies looking at walking speeds in different cities and speech speeds and things like that. I think everybody has a kind of natural look. When we're asleep, the metronome is slow. When we're awake, it's faster. I think everybody has their own intrinsic kind of range. Some people are mellower. Some people are more high intensity. I mentioned Costello, my bulldog. The bulldog is a mellow animal. A whippet or a pit bull, they'll sleep, but when they're awake, it's like that metronome is going tick, 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 higher levels of baseline autonomic arousal. That's what we would call it. It's actually a really nice study published in the Journal of Neuroscience. Looked at MRI of dog brains, live dog brains. They didn't harm the dogs. They just took a lot of different species of dogs and scanned their brains. And some dogs have more kind of frontal activation where they're looking and anticipating the sight hounds. What's out there? What's happening? They're more vigilant. My bulldog, I have one of those little robot vacuums. It sometimes knocks right into his face while he's sleeping. He'll open his eyes. He'll just look at that thing like, So, we know people like that. We know people who are a little more high strung or more of a startle reflex. I think we all need to just learn how to adjust our nervous system around a space and just accept that there are these differences and, lifestyle. And, some people wake up at 4 a.m. and they're ready to charge. I need 2 cups of coffee, 2 cups of tea, some hydration before feel ready to do anything. So I think there's a lot of variation. There's no right or wrong.
When we look at suicide rates, they typically change there's a spike when we go from summer to fall or from summer to fall because of the increase in sunlight and that extended daylight. A lot of people think it happens mostly in the winter, but basically it sounds like you're saying is like the metronome changes of the energy outside doesn't match their energy inside, and it creates this kind of agitation in people. And I think enough people aren't aware of how that change in the seasons can affect them. I mean, we talked about sunlight early on, and now it's too much sunlight. So now you feel like you always have to be on a treadmill, and that your metronome should be going faster than what the time says.
Right. Well, there are a lot of reasons why people commit suicide, and but what you're raising is a really interesting possibility, which is that part of the reason why where statistically people have claimed there are more suicides in the spring as days get longer could be not because people are feeling more alert and better, but because the people around them are feeling more alert and better, and they feel more of the disparity between the way they believe they're functioning and the people around them. That's one idea. I don't know if it's ever been tested. If it has, I haven't seen the study, but that doesn't only reflects my ignorance, not any study. I think, suicide is such a complicated and devastating thing. We have an ability, our nervous system allows us to interocept, which is to pay attention to what's going on within the confines of our skin, including our thoughts and feelings. And we have the ability, also based on our nervous system, to exterocept, to see what's going on in the outside world around us beyond the confines of our skin. And those two things are always in dynamic balance, kind of like two spotlights. One might get brighter, one might get dimmer, one might get bigger, one might get smaller. Sometimes all of our attention is internal, sometimes it's all external. And I've always thought as suicide as a kind of a massive interoception, where almost both spotlights move inward. And if the person's internal state is not one that is pleasant, or is really unpleasant, well, then it can seem like that's the whole universe, because where we focus our attention, it also gives us a sense of time. One of the issues with mental disease, mental health, is that when, if I ask you right now, can you tolerate feeling sad for 1 second? You'd say yes. And I'd say, well, how about a minute? You'd say yes. Say an hour, you'd say yes. But in depression, and in certain forms of anxiety, people feel like the state that they're in is going to either go on forever or is going to keep returning, kind of like a phantom that's going to sneak up out of nowhere and get them, especially when they start feeling better again. So, suicide is a distortion of space and time. It's a distortion of the fact that things change. It's grief can be devastating, but it does not go on forever. But for someone who's in suicidal ideation, it really is a tunnel that they can't see out of. And I think it's not just they can't see out of it physically, they can't see out of it in terms of time. They cannot sense that the possibility of a different reality. We don't understand the neurology around suicide just yet. There's some, there's a certain violent component sometimes, not always. I have a colleague up at the University of Washington who's studying the violence associated with suicide. I can give you his name, and maybe he'd be an interesting person to talk to for the podcast, because there are circuits in the brain for fighting and for violence, and it's rare and non-adaptive to turn those circuits on the self, but they are the same circuits for violence that we see inflicted outwardly on other people. So, neuroscience is doing a lot to try and unpack what these mechanisms are for aggression, for self-aggression, for externalized aggression. But I think we can reasonably say that there's a real distortion of time and space in suicidal ideation, where people are not connected, obviously, to the same reality that other people are connected to. And here I'm not trying to just restate the obvious through a neuroscientific lens, but I think once we can better understand how the brain processes time and bins time, thinks of time bins, moments and pervasiveness of emotion and things like that, I think we're going to be in a position to intervene and help people help a lot of people feel less lost and less in a tunnel where they can't sense a different reality.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing that, because you personally you've lost a couple people to suicide yourself, and you also shared that you had a friend who has schizophrenia, as I did. One of my buddies at the age of 19, schizophrenia hit him. Is there anything that you found in your research to help mitigate or manage schizophrenia? I know that exercise, diet, there's some natural ways to do that, but as neuroscience explains some of what's happening there.
Yeah, so I had a friend growing up who, he was different, but then again, I had a lot of friends who were different. Not all of them became schizophrenic. And he was odd, he was different for sure, but he got involved in taking some amphetamine, and he was doing a lot of psychedelics for a while, and yeah, he went full blown schizophrenic. I think he's still he travels from time to time, I hear, but I think he would, last I heard, he was in the Mission District in San Francisco, and, auditory hallucinations, psychoses, he clearly saw and felt meaning in things that other people don't. And I think the sort of classic view of schizophrenia by the neuroscientists is that it's the dopamine hypothesis, that there's elevated levels of dopamine throughout the brain. Drugs, which they call neuroleptics, they come in two flavors. Typical neuroleptics, which block mainly the D2 dopamine receptor, and then atypical neuroleptics, which block the D4 dopamine receptor. have some success in blocking the auditory hallucinations, which are the most kind of profound effect on schizophrenics. But those drugs are really tough because they make people feel not good. Now, there are better drugs nowadays that have fewer side effects, but they can cause like physical writhing and lip smacking. And, oftentimes you'll see a schizophrenic on the street. You'll think that they're on drugs and they're actually just on their prescription drugs. But then when you see schizophrenics who are off their medication, that can be pretty scary. And sometimes like the catatonic schizophrenics, they're just immobile for days and days. So there's a glutamate hypothesis that got popular for a while. There's this interest in a gene called DISC2, DISC, which in mice seems to recreate, when mutated in mice, can recreate some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. It is a tough problem. I'm not aware of any breakthroughs just yet, but what I can tell you is there are excellent labs working very, very hard on trying to solve this problem. Certainly early detection and leveraging neuroplasticity to try and rewire the brain for the better is one approach, but it has to be caught early. And schizophrenia typically, when people look back, they realize, oh, this person was different, they were strange, but you can't always predict who's going to be schizophrenic. In twin studies, monozygotic, what are called dichorionic twins, so these would be identical twins that shared the same placental sac, there is a higher concordance, meaning if they're separated at birth, even at different families, different circumstances, there's a higher probability that if one twin has schizophrenia, the other one will have it too. So there is a genetic component.
Andrew, is there anything that we haven't? I mean, there's so much more I want to ask you, but I already know I've monopolized a lot of your time.
No, you didn't monopolize my time. I'm grateful to be here. So I have a theory about grief, and I don't know that it solves any problems, but it's something to think about. It's just a theory, but based on an understanding of memory systems in the brain and emotional systems in the brain. So it's not completely unfounded. One idea is that grief, in biology, we think of things as processes, not events. And so they have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And you could imagine that grief, which is, grief has varying intensities. You can be sad, you can be devastated. They have a pervasiveness. It can be quick, it can be long-lived, right? So these are states of mind, and grief is a state of mind that may have some utility. If an animal or a member of a group dies, there's actually a strong evolutionary pressure to not interact with the dead body because it's infectious. If you think about disgust of all kinds, it generally is correlated with potential for infection. So think of all the gross stuff out there. I don't have to name it off. That most of the time it's stuff that can get you sick in addition to just being disgusting. That's not a coincidence. We're hardwired for that. Okay. I'll give a very intense example. It's not meant to trigger anybody, but if you want to think of a behavioral event that has strong evolutionary drive to avoid it, just like you would want to avoid heights or intense heat or anything else that could damage you. Incest is a example where I think most all human beings, I wish all human beings, but I think most all human beings would agree that there's a disgust reflex to the idea of incest. And incest carries a heavy genetic penalty. The offspring of incest relationships have high levels of mutation, right? This is why mating amongst close of kin is discouraged, right? That's not a cultural thing. That's a biological pressure, right? So disgust, like for putrid smells, for things that, smell bad or taste bad, it naturally evoke a visceral reflex of trying to get away from it because it's infectious, right? Now, of course, you can find examples where people like that stuff or they fetishize that stuff, but that stuff is considered perverse. And I'm not judging, but it's not random what we consider perverse. It generally has some evolutionary pressure where those things are detrimental to our health, right? So I won't get into specific examples. I'm sure people can imagine them on their own. Grief is an interesting state of mind because it's a state of mind in which we are feeling intense sadness, but that sadness may have a utility. The utility of that sadness may be to get us to stop interacting with the dead body. Now, we put bodies in the ground, but we also need to stop interacting with the possessions of that person as if they were around. In other words, grief could be viewed as a pressure to start engaging in behaviors that take us away from the physical object of the person. And it's a process. It may actually be the movement of the memory of the person in the brain from actionable items to inactionable items. So let me be a little bit more concrete about this. Let's say I get a new pair of sunglasses that I like. Let's say I love these sunglasses. I really love them. You know, some sunglasses are really expensive. Like, oh, I got these new sunglasses. You love them. Let's say you set them down on a table. You turn around, they're gone. You're like, what? You'll start looking around. You're pretty upset about it, right? The money, you like the sunglasses. This is not like grieving a human loss, but the example holds. Over time, I will adjust. I'm not going to grieve the loss of those sunglasses, okay? But there's a period of time in which I'm really upset about it, and it's because they're no longer actionable. They're not there. And when you listen to people talk about the process of grief, you see something interesting. I actually started thinking about this because I had read a book by the great physicist Richard Feynman. You know, his first wife died very young of tuberculosis, and he talked about how he used to, she died and he didn't quite register the grief until one day he was walking by a store. He looked in the window, he saw a really nice dress, and he thought, wow, I would love to buy that for her. And all of a sudden it hit him like a ton of bricks that she was gone. It's like when we, you know, it's funny. I've lost a number of people, like anyone my age likely has. So my story is not unique. But occasionally, because their phones have been taken over by other people, I'll get a message from them, and they still have their name in my phone as the original person. And for a moment, I think it's them calling me, and then I go, oh no, it's their kid or whatever, which is nice to hear from their kids. But it's like, oh, and grief may actually be the transfer of the memory and concept of someone or something from actionable, like I could reach for it or call them, to inactionable. And it would make sense to me if that were the case, because like if I don't talk to someone for a long, on a daily basis, whether or not they're dead or alive really doesn't impact my daily life, except once I know they're dead, it really impacts my daily life, right? They're no longer actionable in my life. I can't call them. I can't talk to them. I can't send them a letter. I can't go visit them. You get it. So it may be that grief is a process of moving memory of someone or something from one state of actionable to inactionable. Now, that's just intellectualizing the process, and I agree, and I want to acknowledge that doesn't change the process. But I do believe that as humans who have very evolved frontal cortices that allow us to think and analyze things, that sometimes seeing these things that are very primal, fear, anxiety, happiness, grief, seeing those as neurologic processes sometimes can help us orient ourselves when we're feeling like it's just overwhelming. And again, this is just a theory, but if we were to accept that for a moment, just for sake of discussion, that grief might be a process of moving memories from actionable concepts to inactionable concepts, and that process is deliberately painful so that we are careful to not ever act as if the person were still alive, that could be of strong utility, because in the animal kingdom, dead bodies are infectious. In the human kingdom, dead bodies are infectious. There's a strong evolutionary drive to get away from the body. And we bury people, we cremate people, we do various things depending on culture, religion, and background. But anyway, those are just some theories. I think about grief a lot. I have the somewhat complicated reputation of having my undergraduate advisor, my graduate advisor, and my postdoc advisor all die young, so that the joke in my business is, you don't want me to work for you. I can make that joke and I think they would all laugh about that, because each one of them had a sort of morbid sense of humor. But in all seriousness, I realize that everyone out there has stories of grief, and each one is very intense and very valid. I only offer this as sort of angles for thought. I'd be delighted if people disagree with me. I don't claim this to be a grand theory of anything. It's just my thoughts on the subject.
Well, it actually resonates with me because, my father passed away a few years ago and his birthday was recent. And I spent part of my day figuring out how to acknowledge his birthday, how to grieve his loss. And, it always helps when I write a letter to him, even though the
Mm.
letter isn't, going to him in my mind, in my subconscious, it is. And there's just something, soothing and cathartic about writing a letter, sharing my thoughts, talking to him as if he's still here, and even going as far as putting it in an envelope with a stamp and throwing it in a mailbox. And I think that's also the benefit of going to visit the tombstone and the burial site. There's because that's something that's actionable. So when you talk about actionable versus inactionable, that resonates for me because I do find comfort in taking action to connect with whatever the perceived loss is.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think people sometimes ask me, they go, is a scientific life or thinking incompatible with religion or spirituality? Absolutely not. I mean, they're totally compatible. I encourage people, if they're interested in that question and that conversation, our current U.S. director of the National Institutes of Health, his name is Francis Collins. He's a very religious person. He's written about this, about free will versus, science versus religion. Very interesting, very thoughtful writings. You can find them easily online. When we hear that, people live on in us, I believe that, we can still implement the teachings. And I mean, now we're sort of venturing into the personal, but I think it's relevant here. I mean, I can still hear stuff that I was with Ben the entire year before he died. I sat with him and recorded a bunch of conversations with him. I was in the hospital when he had his first heart attack. It was really crazy. I was really close to that whole situation. He was my next door colleague at Stanford, and I'd worked for him for 5 years. So prior to that, so we were really close. And it's crazy. I can still hear things that he said. I can still I do understand what it means, even as a rational scientist, to still feel the person. I can still feel like whatever. And this is because I'm sure it's because our representations of people in our nervous system are our representations. Those are internal representations. Right. And once the person's gone, the internal representation reverberates. It's not like the neurology that represented your father is gone. That neurology is still very active in you in a healthy way, it sounds like, So reconnecting with that neurology is reconnecting with your internal representation of the person. And it can feel very real. And I think, Ben is sorely missed by many, many people. There was many tributes to him, and one in particular comes to mind. The woman, former president of MIT, Nancy Hopkins, and I gave a discussion at Mount Sinai before this whole COVID thing on diversity in science, and we were talking about Ben in the room there, and it was as if he came alive in the room, even though he's very much dead. So these things are legitimate neurological phenomena. And if people want to attach spirituality to them, that's fine. I don't think it's that's not violating any biology. But these are real things. Your nervous system is a map of your experience, and it can be reshaped and rewired, but it is a powerful representation of life. And it's kind of cool to look around and see other people and realize that everyone has these maps inside them of meaning, of experience, and makes what we see in civilization seem that much more spectacular to me, that we can all have these representations, and yet despite the challenges of life, we all still manage to get along, thank goodness, most of the time, although there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, as we know.
Well, and that's what, part of what gets us all out of bed, right, is that my biggest fear is that there's no work to be done. Like I never want to reach that point.
No, well, yeah. Well, knowing a little bit about you and basing my statement on the current status of the world, I think that there will always be work to be done. I mean, I hope whoever's listening to this hopefully will derive. some value from some of the things I've said. But your podcast, I have to say, the name of this podcast caught my attention instantaneously, and it's look, if ever there were a time in human history when there was a calling for people to look inward, look outward, and figure out what they were going to do to better the environment, of course, the natural environment, but just the landscape of humanity, it's now, right? And I'm the eternal optimist. I have to be. I think it's a nervous system thing. It's a brain thing, and it's we're strongly dependent on, who those people are. But it's a collective effort. Everyone's got to ante in.
Now, and to circle back to what, we're talking about in the very beginning about in terms of optic flow and panoramic vision, it's why I part of why I named my podcast what I did, Before You Kill Yourself. It came from a woman on a plane. I was debating the name with a buddy of mine on a flight. We just did some shows in Pakistan. We're coming back, and the plane is parked on a tarmac. We got in a little early. And I'm like, hey, man, I'm thinking about starting a podcast, suicide prevention, call it Before You Kill Yourself. And he's like, oh, I love that. I would listen to that. I love that title. And then this lady a couple rows in front of me says, be careful what you're talking about. You don't know who's listening in. And then proceeds to tell me a story. This is on a plane about how she was in a bathroom with a gun to her head, ready to pull the trigger. And then she heard her baby crying. And she was like, oh, damn, I got to go feed the baby. And that baby saved her life. You talked earlier about how about suicide is, you said a time and space. It's a narrowing of time and space. And it got that narrow for this woman that she forgot that she had a baby and she forgot to feed the baby. And it wasn't until she heard that baby that she was like, oh, damn, I got to go feed the baby. I can't. And that's all it took. And so for me, the idea of the podcast is like to be that crying baby of like, hey, did you feed the baby? Did you do your laundry? Did you send off that email? Because that's how small the window is. It's such a small window.
It's so true. It's so true. Yeah. It's an amazing title for a podcast. And it's, there's suicide leaves people feeling so confused. And I do think that suicidal ideation can be solved as a problem. I think everyone would agree that preventing suicide is an extremely important issue. There are people, for instance, working on sensors that would allow people to know if they were drifting towards suicidality long before they even realized it cognitively. Using some really cool technology. Scientists are, we're a weird bunch. I'll be honest. I mean, I like to think I'm functional adult, but we're weird. We're quirky. We're like artists or musicians. We're obsessed. We love these puzzles and we want to figure it out, but we also really want the results of those efforts to get out into the world and to help. And then, that's why I do podcasts. That's why I do public education. That's why my lab works on trying to cure blindness and stress, PTSD, and anxiety. So scientists, psychologists, I'm sure there are listeners out there, mental health experts, parents, kids. I mean, it's happening. I mean, we're making progress, and it just means it's just going to require more discussions, more science, more of all of it. More of all of it.
Andrew, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think would be of value to the listeners?
Oh, well, thanks for asking. Well, earlier you asked about my story. Well, here's what I'm going to do, Leo. I think I'm happy to share my story, but I think at this point I'd love for people to just think about their stories, and maybe we can circle back at another time, anytime you like. And I'm happy to share my path if you think it could be of value to people. But right now, I think I'd like to just, I just want to emphasize that a little bit of attention on people learning to adjust their neurology through behavioral practices like getting some sunlight, doing physiological size, some gratitude practice. Those little things give you a handle on a system in your body and brain that at times in our less good moments can feel like it controls us, but they're good in the moment because they help, but they also are good in later moments because they remind us that we have this control panel, our breathing, our vision, our behaviors, and learn that control panel. None of us have to be a slave to our own neurology. And look, I acknowledge there are people out there who might have chemical imbalances or need prescription medication, therapy, and these kinds of things. It's all of value. There's great trained professionals out there that can help you navigate that. But everybody, those people and everyone as healthy as they feel, can learn to tap into their neurology a bit through these healthy ways. That's my hope. And do it. And I encourage you to do it. I encourage you to be action oriented and to learn yourself through the system of these behavioral practices and reflect on them, improve on them. I'm just one voice in an ocean of voices, and it does require a whole community. I have one request. Sorry for the music outside. Someone's it's a Friday, and I don't know if that's coming through, and they're blasting some music. But my one request is if you do find something to be of use, we have a saying in science, which is watch one, do one, teach one, which is, if you find something you like and it works for you, maybe it's physiological size or morning sunlight or whatever, pass along those tools to people. Watch one, do one, teach one. It should be watch one, do many, teach many, but watch one, do one, teach one. It's just kind of a reminder that, these practices are of value, but the more people that do them, the better. I don't need or want credit. Mother Nature holds the patent. So this is not a business thing for me. Maybe consider passing along some tools if you find they work for you. And if they don't, toss them aside and keep going. Look for the ones that do.
Thanks a lot, Andrew. And last question, I ask this of all my guests, because I always imagine there's one person listening in who may be on the precipice of ending their life. Before you kill yourself, what would you say to them, Andrew?
Remember that your perception of time, not your perception of self, is the problem in that moment. And that your perception of time can be returned to your control. When people are in a moment of wanting to kill themselves, they have lost, for reasons that, are going to differ from person to person, but they've lost a sense of time. That we hear the words, this too shall pass. Those words are meaningless to a person who's in that dark tunnel. But realizing that the perception of time is a neurologic phenomenon, like a mosquito bite, it itches no matter what you tell yourself about it. But remembering that the mosquito bite is not a disease, the mosquito bite is not you. It's an inflammation. It's a shift in your skin, just like suicidal ideation is a shift in your neurology and your perception of time. And if you can readjust your perception of time, I do think that there might be a portal to a mode of thinking where you'll find yourself in a place of wanting to sustain your life and persevere, and not just persevere and grind it out, but really, hit some smoother running roads. I know this because I've seen it. I've seen the transitions that people have gone into and out of these states. And I just hope if somebody's on that edge or they're close to that edge, that they understand that their neurology is modifiable and it's not who they are. Identity, it's a small piece of their neurology. It is not their identity. So that's what I have to offer.
Thank you so much, Andrew. And thank you so much, listeners, for tuning in. Remember, this podcast is not a substitute for you going to get help, for you calling the 1-800-SUICIDE or 273-TALK or the other international phone numbers. There's talk, there's text, there's someone out there who is willing and ready to hear your story. And you can always go to thrivewithleo.com for one-on-one coaching with yours truly. Let's get to tomorrow together. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Thank you.